For God's sake, do not let your schools and your universities denigrate science by equating it to a bundle of mythology, superstition, empirical claims that are by no means co-equal with science. Because in the end, New Zealand will become the laughingstock of the world scientifically.
Welcome to The Shape of Dialogue. Today I've got a very special guest from the University of Chicago, Emeritus Professor Jerry Coyne. Jerry is an evolutionary biologist, and it's a great honour to talk to him today. So welcome to The Shape of Dialogue, Jerry.
Well, thanks. It's great to be back in New Zealand, even if it's virtually.
Yeah.
I've been trying to get back there for 3 years, but your prime minister won't let me.
Yeah, well, when it opens up, you'll be welcomed with open arms.
Yeah.
Okay, so do you want to start telling us, first of all, how you became an evolutionary biologist, and maybe even talk about what an evolutionary biologist is, and talk about your research and your findings and what you're doing now?
That's a big mouthful.
Yeah.
I'll try to make it short because I'm sure that people are more interested in the ideas rather than who I am. Well, first of all, an evolutionary biologist is somebody who studies evolution. I mean, there's a gazillion different ways to study evolution: animal behavior, molecular biology, the fossil record, biogeography. Any of those people can. I happen to be an evolutionary geneticist, which means that I use genetics to find out stuff about evolution. And what I did, I'm no longer in the laboratory anymore because I'm retired. But what I did when I was active was study how new species are formed. It's the origin of species question, which was, adumbrated by Darwin, but he never answered it in his book. That's the most mistitled book in history. Um, should have been called The Origin of Adaptations. Anyway, when I started out, we really didn't know much about how a new species form. And it's hard to do that research because you're not there when it happens, when one lineage branches into two. And it takes a long time. And so, how do you figure it out? So, the way I did it was genetically. That is, I would take two closely related species that had a recent common ancestor that you could cross in the laboratory. Now, the definition of species is in nature where they co-occur, they do not cross. They're reproductively disjunct. But you can force flies of different species, just like you can lions and tigers, to mate with one another if you keep them in confined conditions. And once you can do that, then you can do genetic analysis of the number of genes that are responsible for the reproductive barriers between them, where those genes are, whether there's any regularities in the kind of process that made different pairs of species. And the answer is yes, there is. So the ability to cross species, and I use Drosophila, fruit flies, which has a generation time of about 12 days in the lab. So you can go through, uh, 20 generations a year. So you can do a pretty good genetic analysis of the differences between species. Once you know the kinds of genes that have changed between species A and B that have had to be identical in their common ancestor, then you can get a handle on, well, what happened over evolutionary time to make a new species. So that's what I did for most of my career. And I wrote a book about speciation, which I don't expect the layperson to be able to read. It's a technical book, but it is, I think, the definitive book in the field because progress is slow, just like speciation is. That was in 2009. Um, how I got to this point, as is so often the case, is charismatic teachers. I mean, every biologist at some point in their career wants to be a marine biologist. They envision themselves standing on the bow of a boat and watching whales, really romantic, dramatic stuff. And I did that too when I went into college. But the first day of college, excuse me, my first class at 8 a.m., the first day of college, freshman year, was introductory zoology, and it happened to be taught by an evolutionary biologist, herpetologist. he was extremely charismatic. He presented the subject so compellingly that I thought, well, this is really cool. And I did really well in the class because I liked it. Notice it's zoology, not evolutionary biology, but he taught it from a evolutionary standpoint. So whenever he talked about a feature, he would discuss, well, how did this come about through natural selection or evolution? So I asked him, could I take genetics next year? And you're not supposed to be able to take genetics until your third year, but he thought, well, yeah, why not? I mean, I can get you into that class. And he did. And the combination of evolution and genetics to me was just absolutely compelling. And the reason I like genetics is because the results are so clean. I mean, it's like Mendel's results. You have discrete entities, genes whose segregation can be monitored and followed over generations, and you usually get unambiguous answers about at least the genes. Maybe not about how they changed by evolution, but at least you can quantify that. So by the time I was out of college, I was already an evolutionary geneticist working with fruit flies, and I'm really glad I did that.
I really like the irony of starting out thinking you'd be looking at whales and you end up looking at fruit flies.
Yeah, well, when I've talked to other biologists, almost all of them confess this desire at some point in their career to be a marine biologist.
Right.
But real marine biologists, they don't have that romantic a life. They're just as likely as I am to be squinting down a microscope or
Yeah, yeah.
you um,
I'm a massive Beatles fan, so just tell the story about Sergeant Pepper and how that got you into science.
well, no, it didn't get me into science.
Well,
It made me an atheist. So I don't know.
is that what it was? Okay, well,
Yeah, I
tell
don't know.
that story. That's right. Yes,
All
sorry.
right.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, most people that I've talked to, and I wasn't religious. I mean, I was brought up Jewish, but as with most American Jews, they're barely distinguishable from atheists. And so I went to Hebrew school for a while, but I didn't do very well. It's the only class I ever didn't do well in was Hebrew. So, I flunked out basically and was put in the girls' class to prepare them for bas mitzvah instead of bar mitzvah. And the shame of being in an all girls class at age 12 was what drove me out out of religiosity. But, I still sort of believed in God. When I was bad, my parents would threaten me with God's, they say, God will punish you. And, I never really questioned that, but nor did I embrace it. Um, But most people who are religious, it takes them a long time to work their way out of the belief system. And the deeper you are in the belief system, the longer it takes and the more traumatic it is. Because I wasn't really that religious a Jew, my deconversion was instantaneous. And I can pinpoint it exactly. It was the first time that I listened to the Sgt Pepper album. My parents weren't home. I came home from the store with this album. Back then they had albums. There's a picture of all the 50, 60 people on the cover. And I put it on my parents' record player, and I sat down on the couch. And people ask me, okay, what was it about this record that made you give up your belief in God? And my answer is, I don't know. But somewhere in the middle of that music, something clicked inside of me. It made me realize that there was no evidence for God. That everything I've been taught was not based on evidence at all. Remember, I was still in high school, and it was 69. I'm not sure. I can't remember when the album came out. And
67.
67. Okay, so that means that was the year before I graduated high school. Um, and the realization that, there was no evidence for God, because it was completely an evidential based thing. Um, got me thinking about the implications, and the main implication is, well, geez, I'm going to die, and that's it. And that's a scary thought. So I started sweating, and I got really, really upset for a few minutes.
Uh,
And then I'd say after 10 minutes later, I was fine. And ever since it's been, I haven't looked back. And I can't tell you what song was playing. Is Within You Without You? I think that's on Revolver. Probably a George Harrison song or
no,
something. But
that's on Sergeant Pepper.
oh, okay. Well, it might
Yeah,
well be that have been that song, but
yeah,
I
yeah.
can't pinpoint it. Yeah, but it was, I'd say, in the space of 20 minutes, I went from someone who believed in God to someone who was an atheist in the sense that I saw there was no evidence for God.
Right.
You know, anti-theism, my conviction that there's almost certainly no God. That's different from just straight atheism. That's the Dawkinsian view that your belief in God is on a scale from 0 to 7. He says he's a 6.9. I'm probably right up there with him. It's sort of a Bayesian approach to believing in God. You know, if we have no evidence, but there should be evidence, and there isn't any, so the priors against God get higher and higher and higher, and eventually I became an anti-theist, which is why I wrote my book, you know, Faith versus Fact: Why Science and Religion Are Incompatible.
Yeah. Well, that's a good segue into really what this whole thing's about, because I'm titling this podcast "Science versus Other Ways of Knowing." So, just to give a bit of context to the listeners, there's a bit of a controversy going on in New Zealand at the moment. 7 University of Auckland professors wrote a open letter articulating that Mātauranga Māori, which is traditional Māori knowledge, is not science, because there's been a government white paper encouraging non-scientific material in Mātauranga Māori being given parity in the science classroom. And for more context, there's a whole spiel in the show notes for anyone who is not up to speed on this. But so that's really what we're going to talk about today. But I think it's probably quite important to define a few things. Like, let's start out with what is science.
Well, you know, there's a gazillion ways to define it. You have to pick one. In my book, Faith versus Fact, I have to start off with these definitions. And I conceive of science as a toolkit, a series of tools, you know, physical and mental, that you use to uncover what's true about the cosmos. Those tools can include, you know, observation, test hypothesis formation, hypothesis testing, experimentation, replication of other people's results, which is a very important part of science. And then we have the tools of uh, academic science, you know, peer review of papers and rejection, publication in professional journals, getting grants. I tend to take a broader view of science, that it's just a series of tools that you use to find out what the truth is. But one of the very important tools in there is consensus. That is, there are no private truths. There are no truths that are in principle inaccessible to any other person or any other group. And when you finally get this consilience of belief, then that's what we say is knowledge. So I conceive of science as a kit of tools that brings you eventually knowledge, which is a consensus belief. And it doesn't mean it's an absolute truth. I mean, all scientists will tell you that we don't arrive at absolute truth. We would have no way of knowing when we arrived at absolute truth. There's not a buzzer that goes off that says, "Bleh," you can stop your research now because there's nothing more to find. Um, but yeah, nevertheless, when I say that, I have to give a caveat, which is that there are so many things that we are so absolutely sure about that you would bet your entire house, your entire life savings that they're true. Like the formula of water is H2O. Now you can say, well, someday down the line, somebody's going to find out there's an extra oxygen atom in there, but it's almost impossible for that to be true. And so we find things that are pretty goddamn close to being truth. Sorry if I'm not allowed to curse, but I consider scientific truth. I think Steve Gould defined it as, you know, things that are the subject of common assent, from which it would be perverse to withhold your agreement. And to say that water is not H2O is perverse, you know.
Yeah.
And likewise with evolution. I mean, that's why I wrote my book, Why Evolution is True, because we have so much evidence for evolution that, although they can say it's a theory of evolution, that's only meaningful in the same sense as the theory of atoms or the germ theory of infectious disease is true. We have so much evidence for it that it would be perverse to withhold um, assent. I had a little bit of trouble calling my book Why Evolution is True because it was considered an in your face title. Here's this guy telling me that evolution is true. Well, I think probably this isn't the case in New Zealand, but most Americans have severe doubts about
Mm,
evolution.
mm,
Only about 22% accept evolution the way I teach it in school. About 40% or more are young Earth creationists. They believe the Genesis story in chapters 1 and 2 of a divine creation within the last 10,000 years. And another 30 odd percent or so are um, people that aren't sure. Those include people that say, well, maybe things evolved, but humans are the special product of God's intervention. So, I mean, most of my career, although not in this school, which is a very good one, but just lecturing out in public, um, I faced opposition to my views. I mean, if I just go into like a public library in a school and give a lecture about why evolution is true, you face a lot of pushback. And when I did that in Georgia, I had to have armed guards. I couldn't believe they assigned this huge guy packing a gun to just to, you
right.
know, be there in case. And sure enough, twice during my lecture, people came running down the aisle at me. One was drunk, the other was religious, but this is what you face. And so after going through decades of this, I just decided, well, why are people so resistant to evolution? And there's only one answer to that, which is religion. Because if you're not religious, there is no reason to deny the massive evidence for evolution. I've never met a single a single creationist that was not motivated by religion. There is not a single creationist organization in America that is not at bottom religious.
Mm.
So so I figure, okay, what is it about religion that, is makes people so um, rejecting of science? And it's easy. I mean, because science has the ability to find out the truth about the cosmos, and religion doesn't, but they pretend they do. I mean, we have debunked through archaeology and history and other scientific or quasi-scientific practices many things. The Exodus from Egypt, not true. The census that supposedly got Jesus to Bethlehem, not true. Israelites wandering in the desert for 40 years, not true. And of course, we have no extra biblical evidence for the existence of Jesus or even God. I mean, the way the world is set up just does not bespeak of the kind of God that you see in the Bible, which again, if you have a Bayesian view, leads into more high priors against.
Sorry, just explain Bayesian for those who don't know
No,
what it is.
Bayesian is it's just a way of assigning greater weight to a hypothesis as more evidence comes in.
Yeah.
So, for example, when Darwin wrote his book in 1859, they didn't really have much of a fossil record. There just wasn't very much paleontology, and we didn't, you know, have a good series of transitional fossils in Darwin's time. Just a few, but not enough. He made his case for evolution based on biogeography and embryology, parallels with the success of artificial selection. Um, so, based on those, you could assign yourself a sort of mental weight on, well, is this guy right or not? And that's basically the probability that the hypothesis is true given what you know. That's a Bayesian probability.
Yeah.
Now later on, but it was sufficiently compelling that within about 10 years of 1859, virtually every, scientifically thinking person in the UK was accepted it. And since then, we have come up with a gazillion more evidence, and some of the best is the fossil record, because we now can see transitional forms, and we can date them using radiometric dating, and like whales and horses, and of course humans. Now have that. Darwin could only speculate in 1859 that humans had evolved from other forms of organisms. Um, the one sentence is in his book, The Origin of Species, is light will be shed on the origin of man. Well, of course, it's paternalistic because he doesn't say woman, but that was a generic man. But he didn't have any evidence for that, except for the fact that we're very similar to apes, and that's about it. But then since then, we found the early fossils in Africa, exactly where they should be if we evolved from the great apes, which live in Africa, or the small apes. And we now have a complete branching bush of human evolution. So when you get that, then you have more evidence for evolution. And so you can assign it a higher weight in your mind. Now, how much more weight to give it? That's the whole controversy about Bayesian probability, because you have to plug figures into it. But what you can say with assurance is that we know with greater assurance now than Darwin did that his theory of evolution by natural selection is much more true than it was in 1859. In fact, I would say it is true. Nobody's going to find anything that could disprove evolution. I say it with almost complete assurance
Yeah.
because we have so much evidence that all points to the same thing.
Yeah. It's to do with probability.
Yeah, I
And
mean,
I mean,
yeah,
it is possible both of us could be struck down by lightning right in the next 5 minutes, but at the same time, but it's highly improbable.
yeah. Although if it started thundering and lightning and you went outside, then your Bayesian probability would increase.
Yeah, if you want to be hit by lightning, there are certain places you can go, and you hold a big metal shaft, and you'll get it. Um, uh, so the other thing about science, and I think Darwin is a great case, is when science makes predictions, and often they have to be essentially risky predictions. I mean, it's not really that scientific for me to say the sun's going to come up tomorrow. But for Darwin to say what he said when he said it was, I mean, looking back from now, it's an incredible prediction. So, do you want to just talk to that? How science you start out with a prediction, then you aim to test it and falsify it. So the fact of falsifiability is really important.
Yeah, well, falsifiability is important. That is, if your theory is not capable of being shown to be wrong, then and there's nothing you can adduce to show that it's wrong, then it's not a scientific theory because it can't be disproven. If you can't disprove something, then you can't get credence in it. An example of an unscientific theory is one I had when I was a child, which is when I had all my toys and stuffed animals. My theory was when I left the room, they'd all get up and become animated and play and stuff. And then before I came back, they'd resume their position, and they'd resume it exactly in the same position I left them. Now that's basically an unfalsifiable theory. Although you can think of ways now to falsify it, like putting a nanny cam in the bedroom. But there's lots of I think Christianity is an unfalsifiable hypothesis.
God is
Yeah,
unfalsifiable.
God is unfalsifiable.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so much evidence against the kind of God that's depicted in the scripture, in the Christian Bible at least, that you know he should people should say, okay, this guy doesn't exist. He gives little kids leukemia. He causes mutations. He makes species go extinct. He makes
We all die.
Yeah, we all die. I mean, what's that about? And
Yeah.
some of us go to hell. You know,
Yeah.
if you're one of these pre. I can't remember what they call them. There's people who think that you're predestined to go to hell. You don't even have a choice in the matter.
Mm.
There's also, things like the view of many Christians that you could be saved by faith alone. So if Hitler was on his deathbed and he said, "I believe in Jesus Christ," well, then he's going to heaven. I mean, this stuff
Yeah.
really strains credibility. So if religion, insofar as it makes fact claims like God exists or Jesus existed, is an empirical hypothesis. It's just that it's an unfalsifiable hypothesis.
Yeah.
I can't remember where we got off on this, but Darwin, yeah, the scientific method. So,
So making risky predictions.
yeah, well, I mean, what you said, I'd like to push back a little bit on it because everybody is taught that There's a scientific method that goes
Mm,
like this.
mm.
You see something, you then try to explain it by making a hypothesis. Then you test the hypothesis through either observation or experiment. And then it's either supported, in which case your credence becomes higher, the Bayesian belief in the hypothesis being true increases, or it's falsified, and then you reject the hypothesis. Because one thing science can do is falsify hypotheses. Like, for example, mammals evolved before reptiles did. I mean,
Right.
that's falsified.
Yeah.
But that's not the way that all science works. Um, Paul Feyerabend, who I think was one of the mentors of Robert Noah, who is one of the people who signed that letter. I
So
asked Robert the other day, what Feyerabend was very famous for destroying the simplistic version of how science works, which is hypothesis, test, affirmation, or deaffirmation. His view was basically anything goes.
yeah.
People must understand that what he meant, I think, is that you can test hypotheses, or you can find out what's true in a number of different ways. And the reason I say that is because the origin of species is not an explicitly predictive kind of science. It was accepted as true, even though it made only one prediction, which was not even testable until many years later, actually until the turn of the 20th century when they found the early human fossils. That's the one prediction I can think of, although there's a lot of implications of Darwin's theory. But why it was accepted is not because of predictions, it's because of what I call retrodictions. That is, it was able to explain a number of facts that had previously puzzled biologists that made no sense at all, um, but suddenly made sense under the idea that we had evolved from ancestors who were very different from us, that had happened over a long period of time, that lineages branched into other lineages and things like that. So, for example, Darwin has huge chapters on embryology. You know, why does a human embryo produce a thick coat of hair at the age of 6 months when it's still in the womb and then shed it before it's born? I mean, it makes no sense at all, because you don't need to be warm when you're sitting in a 98-degree or 37-degree and you're fluid. It makes sense under the view that we evolved from primates that developed a coat of hair that did stay after they were born, some kind of probably a chimpanzee like ancestor. And sure enough, if you look at a chimpanzee in development, they produce a coat of hair about that same time, but they keep it. Why do we do it? We just have that, we retain the ancestral genes for that material. So Darwin talks a lot about these sort of embryonic traits that only make sense unless if evolution be true. He also talks about vestigial organs, the wisdom teeth, the fact that I'll wiggle my ears. I'll try to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you can
Yep.
probably.
Yep. We can see it.
Yeah, so I'm doing that using three muscles in my head that are of no use at all in human beings, but are used in our relatives like dogs and cats to help
Right.
them vocalize
Right.
sound.
Right.
Now, unless you have the theory that we're related to these other organisms that use that character in an adaptive way, it doesn't make any sense. And one more example is the biogeography, the distribution of plants and animals across the planet. Again, Darwin didn't make predictions, but he made retrodictions. Part of that came from his voyage on the Beagle in 1831 to 1836. He observed, it's true in the Galapagos, that islands that have risen up above from the seafloor without being connected to a continent, these are called oceanic islands, almost invariably lack native mammals, um, reptiles, and native amphibians, but they have lots of insects, plants, and birds. So,
Yeah.
why was he so niggardly about dispensing vertebrate life on these islands?
Yeah.
Whereas islands that used to be connected to continents like Great Britain, um, or Madagascar, they're rife with these kinds of life. So these unbalanced nature of faunas that contain on islands the exact kinds of animals you would predict would be there if those animals evolved from animals or plants that got to islands. How can you explain that? And in fact, this fact about biogeography, the depauperate nature of oceanic islands, as opposed to the rich nature of life on continental islands. Um, there's no other way to explain it except that what is on oceanic islands is what happened to get there. Plants can float, there's seeds, or birds can fly over there and poop them out, and birds can, and of course, and insects can fly or be blown to islands. So that's why you have lots of birds and insects and plants on islands, but no mammals, reptiles, or amphibians because they can't get there. I mean, try to get a mammal to the Hawaiian Islands. I mean, it would have to swim for thousands of miles in order to get there. So, that's not a prediction. That's a series of observations that were disconnected from one another and only came together when Darwin, and this is his innate genius, which is makes us all admire him. He was able to absorb all these facts over a period of 20, 30 years, and all of a sudden assemble them in his mind. These only make sense in our hypothesis. So in my book, I call these retrodictions, which I think I invented that word, but
It's a great term. I like it.
yeah. So that shows you that you can do science and accept hypotheses as true without having to make testable hypotheses that you have to go out and test in the future. You can look back to the past and see if, I mean, of course, this is what astronomers do all the time, right?
Yeah,
This
yeah,
is how they reconstruct how stars form and how they die. We're not there when it happens unless you happen to see a nebula, but you can see all the stages of formations of stars in the sky. And from that, you can construct a hypothesis that makes sense about star formation. So.
yeah. I'm just going to ask a devil's advocate question. I mean, I've had people say to me, "Oh, well, science is, we've got religion, which is a story. Science is just another story."
Well, it's a very different kind of story because it's first of all, it's a testable story, right? I mean, if somebody said that to me, and they have said that to me,
Mm,
the
mm.
first question I was in a seminar about 20 years ago here when I had one of these guys, probably a cultural anthropologist. Sorry to put a slur on that discipline, but that is one of the fields that is susceptible to this kind of wokeness. He said that there was no substantive difference between Western medicine and a shaman.
Yeah,
Who
that's the sort of argument I've
Yeah,
had
and
too.
so I raised my hand at the end and I said, "Well, could you tell me when your kids get sick, do you take them to a doctor or a shaman?" You know? And he
Yeah.
hadn't even thought of that. I mean, it's the simplest question. These people that claim that science is one story and religion is another story, well, ask them, when if your kid had an infection, would you take him to a faith healer or to a doctor? And like, unless they're completely
Or
insane. And
or a naturopath.
naturopathic.
Do you go to the emergency department at the hospital, or do you rush off to the naturopath?
Yeah, well, I mean, there are some people that are crazy enough to do, and the
Yeah.
kids usually die. I have a whole chapter in first.
Most rational people will take their
Yeah,
children to the
and
hospital.
so that I mean, that alone, the way people live their lives from day to day shows you that they have a f I call it I don't like to call it faith in science, let's call it confidence in science. They don't have the same kind of confidence in their religious beliefs.
Well,
So they're
it's
you know
science works. I mean, just look at what we're doing now. You're in Chicago, I'm in Auckland, and we're having a free conversation over the internet. I mean, that is it is. I say we live in science fiction, really, and so it actually
yeah.
provably works. And everyone lives a scientific life now. Everyone's on their phones. Everything is, we're covered in science. Our clothes couldn't be made without the scientific method, because science produces technology. It's endless. But what's interesting is there's sort of a blindness to what's in front of people when they come up with those suggestion like science is just another story.
Well, then, I mean, you can spend your time, arguing with them. I mean, ask them, does religion or any other way of knowing come up with the COVID vaccines? No. I mean, the COVID vaccine is a really great story on how a number of independent lines of research that didn't have at its end a prediction that we're going to be able to put messenger RNA in our cells to make proteins that will activate the immune system. I mean, or CRISPR technology, the use of cutting and pasting in biological engineering. All those things were the result of just curiosity and peer research. People didn't set out to make them. So it's different from technology too. Technology is the product that you have once you have the science in place.
Yeah.
People get on airplanes. I mean, they live their lives as if science were true. Now some people will live their lives as if religion was true, but when the rubber meets the road and your kid gets, you know, a bad infection, you rely on science.
Yeah. There's one more thing about the scientific method, which I literally learnt last night. I'm reading the Jonathan Rauch's book, The Constitution of Knowledge, and he talks about the social network and how important that is. So the development of essentially, as an individual, you're limited, but if you share that information among a network, among an association, um, that can be tested, peer reviewed, and amplified. He gave a the example he used was penicillin. You'll have to remind me. I can't remember who's the guy who discovered
Fleming,
penicillin. What? Sorry, say that again.
Alexander Fleming.
That's right, Fleming. Yes, and Fleming discovered it by accident, wrote a paper on it, and then did nothing about it. He didn't really think it was going to be of any value. And then I think it was 10 years later, two American scientists, I think, they took it up. So without that social network, it could have been, who knows how long it would have taken until we had
Yeah.
penicillin.
Well,
So yeah,
yes, I mean, that's why the science, one of the key pieces of this or tools in the scientific toolkit is consensus. If you make a claim, particularly a claim that's amazing, outstanding, or unpredictable, um, other people are going to immediately rush to verify it. That's not just out of pure love of the truth. It's
oh,
because if you can show the other guy's wrong, you get
yeah.
famous yourself.
Yeah, well, that's what I was going to say, or falsify it. I
Yeah,
mean,
or-
I
yeah,
interviewed Steven Pinker recently, and he said as soon as something is proposed, it's a target for falsification. So you have sort of the best of both worlds. You have attackers and supporters, don't you? And that winnows out the truth from the falsities.
yeah, that's true. I mean, that goes. We'll probably talk about this later. The free speech, the idea
Yeah,
that
well, that's what I was going to talk about next, actually. So, talk to tell me what your thoughts on free speech are.
I wanted to say one thing about the consensus truth. Yeah, and that is this. And remind me when I finish this
Yeah,
brief digression what we were talking about. This is another thing that differentiates science from other ways of knowing, which includes, Mātauranga. I don't know if I pronounced it wrong.
yeah.
Maori. Um,
Mātauranga Māori. There you go.
Mātauranga Maori. I'm trying to learn to pronounce these words, but I don't have any Maori in
Yeah,
Chicago
that's right.
to learn them. That it's it's not a private truth, but it's an ethnic truth. There is a group of people. Your iwi, is that correct?
Yeah, well, before we go, let's just I'll give you a definition of Mātauranga Māori for the listeners.
Okay.
So this definition is from the online Maori dictionary. So it is essentially Maori knowledge or Maori traditional knowledge, and it seems to encompass everything associated with Maori knowledge. So it can be from Maori carving to the Maori worldview, the Maori mythology, uh, the cultural practices. It is it seems to be an umbrella term for everything Maori.
Yeah. So yeah, I guess we're gonna have that
Yeah,
as
we'll
a
have
separate
that discussion. Yeah, we'll get on
but
to that.
but that's what happens when you have no, well, two things happens. First of all, when you have a sort of private or subjective knowledge, granted, this subjective knowledge is passed down to your kids by verbal or oral tradition, or by when you go to the group meeting house. What is that thing called?
The whare.
Yeah,
Yeah,
when you go there. So it's reinforced. So it's like religion as well. These are sort of private or subjective knowledges that differ from culture to culture to culture. And so there's no way of telling which one is correct because you Catholics cannot cross argue with Muslims or Hindus, and Maori can't cross argue with the Inuits of Alaska. I mean, those conversations, there's no way to determine who, if anybody, is right or has the truth about the cosmos. And so ev- that's sort of writ large when one person has a revelation, which is subjective knowledge. The difference between science and all these other so-called ways of knowing is critical, and that is that science is a universal way that anybody can participate in. It's not limited to any ethnic group or gender or anything, and eventually it comes to a consensus about what's true. Whereas these other they're called ways of knowing, but they're not really ways of knowing. They're ways of attaining cohesion and belief. That's why they differ from science, and you know,
Right. Well, let's just touch on free speech and
yeah,
your thoughts on that, and then we'll get back. We'll return to that subject.
yeah. Well,
So,
I mean, yeah,
for a start, what is free speech?
well, free speech, as I conceive it, is what is codified by the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, which is basically what it says is you can pretty much say anything you want without being punished by the government. I mean, you can be punished by your company, you can be punished by your spouse, but you don't get any official. There's no governmental um, stricture that will punish you for saying anything you want, with a few exceptions that are narrowly carved out. You can't defame somebody, you can't false advertise, you cannot create harassment in the workplace. You know, like for example, if somebody in my department kept calling me a dirty Jew, eventually that would be considered not free speech because it creates a hostile environment or the incitement of imminent violence. So if you speak to a crowd and say, "Okay, we're going to burn down that building there now, let's go do it," it has to be predictable. It has to be imminent, and it has to be have been urged on by the speaker. Those are the exceptions to free speech. Everything else you can say and not get punished.
So basically, you can say what you like as long as it doesn't harm others.
Well, it depends on what you mean by
Well,
harm.
sorry, no, yeah, I'll rephrase that actually.
Yeah.
Say what you like as long as it doesn't physically harm others.
Yeah, or psychically in the case of defamation or
Yeah.
workplace harassment. So
Yes.
the
Yeah.
definition of harm,
Yeah.
for
Okay.
example, Americans now are trying, many of them, and many of them on the left, I'm sad to report, because I'm on the left, are trying to get rid of this notion of free speech because it causes mental distress in many people. A lot of college kids, that's what
Mm.
trigger warnings are about.
Yeah. So John Stuart Mill talks about this.
Yeah,
He's saying the issue with the sort of the mental harm, or harm in inverted commas, is that it's ephemeral. So if I bludgeon you over the head with a club, that's not ephemeral. But if I did call you a dirty Jew, and I'm half Jewish, so I probably wouldn't. Um, but sure, that may hurt your feelings, but it is actually ephemeral. And in a sense, you have a cognitive choice whether to take offence or not. I think that's the world's a very brutal place, even in this day and age. Um, but if I bludgeon you over the head, you've actually got no choice other than to feel that pain. Where I always go back to say Martin Luther King, and how he held his head up high regardless of what he was being called. So in a sense, he didn't take offence, and he chose not to take offence, and actually sort of think well of the people who were abusing him. Which, so again, you do have choice. I mean, obviously there are some edge cases where if you have a whole classroom of students calling one person a racist epithet, you know, but I think that's quite an important distinction.
yeah, no, I mean, Mills, um, underrated. I always thought that instead of indoctrinating in entering college students with woke doctrine, which is done almost everywhere in the United States now.
Just sorry,
They just
define what woke is. Some people don't
Oh,
know what that is.
well, woke means different things to different people, and it used to be something that was laudatory. It meant aware of inequalities. If you were woke, it started in the African American community. If you were woke, then you were attuned to racism and oppression, which is fine. But it's like politically correct, which started off the same way as a laudatory adjective. But now woke has transmogrified itself into a pejorative word, and that's the way I use it. So I never use woke as laudatory because it's just not what it means anymore to most people. To me, wokeness is the idea that you are trying to show your virtue or your political ideology by a performative gesture, by doing something that looks like you're accomplishing something, but doesn't really accomplish anything. And a lot of this policing of speech. There was an article by Lawrence Krauss in the Wall Street Journal yesterday where they got to get rid of the word smartphone. This is dictated by Google because it implies that there's dumb phones.
Well, there are dumb phones.
Well, there are. In fact, they're called dumb phones. I discovered this by Google, but you can't say
I
senior
used to
citizen.
I used to have one
Yeah,
back
oh,
in
yeah,
the day.
me too. Yeah.
Yeah.
And there are still things. When I was Googling it, I found that here's the list of the 20 best dumb phones, which don't do much more than make phone calls or stuff. So,
So
and you,
what they're saying is you can't make an adjudication.
sorry, sorry,
What they're saying is that you
yeah,
can't make an adjudication anymore. You can't
or
say this is good, this is bad. But this is meanwhile they are choosing to wear a particular type of fashion. You know, they wear you know, the styliest clothes, for example. They'll drive a car which they like. So life is about adjudication.
yeah, it's not really saying you can't make an adjudication. It's saying you have to make the same adjudication I
Yeah.
do.
Yeah.
That's what Logan says. It's an authoritarian movement of the left.
Well, yeah, yeah,
The right is an authoritarian. I mean, Christ, who could be more authoritarian than Donald Trump?
yeah,
You know,
yeah,
but it's called the horseshoe theory that the right and the left are
yeah.
both converging in this form of authoritarian suppression of speech. Um, I happen to agree with Mill. I mean, reading that book, which I did, because I haven't been
So
a free.
that's on Liberty, just yeah,
Yeah, on
clarify.
Liberty. Yeah, Christopher Hitchens. If you go on YouTube, there's a speech he gave in Canada. I think there's 20 minutes defending free speech. If you want a 20-minute, and maybe you can put this in the notes or something. It is the
Yeah,
finest defense of free speech I've ever seen. He
okay,
starts
I'll
off
do
by
that.
saying, "Well, I assume that you're all familiar with these things of these harbingers of free speech. John Stuart Mill's on Liberty, Areopagitica by Milton." And he lists all these arcane things. Of course, nobody knew about them except for Hitchens, but Mill is accessible to everybody. I mean, his idea, which I accept, is that you cannot arrive at the truth if you suppress people from saying what they think. That's absolutely instantiated in science. You're not going to find out what's true unless you have a number of voices trying to disprove you. I mean, when you make a great finding, you don't get famous by saying being the second guy to make that finding. I mean, when Darwin wrote his book, he was attacked widely by many people. He had friends like Thomas Henry Huxley, but in the United States and other places, a number of people went against him. It was only through this clash of ideas that we established that evolution was true. Now, I don't think it's always true, especially in the political realm, that a clash of ideas is inevitably going to lead you to the truth. I mean, we've been clashing about how to raise up oppressed minorities in America for ever since the 60s. And they're doing much better than they did before Dr. King. But we still don't know, how to gain equality in schooling. We've tried throwing money at the schools. It hasn't worked. We It's hard to do these kinds of social experiments. You can't do a social experiment the way you can do a biological experiment. So, but one thing is for sure, if you suppress one side of an argument, you're never going to get to the truth.
Yeah.
You may never get to the truth even in the marketplace of ideas, but
Well, you actually get totalitarianism.
Yeah,
You know,
you have
and that's and it is a slippery slope. And if I mean, I'm a student of history, I love history, and I've looked into authoritarian regimes. The first edict, once a totalitarian gets in, is to close down free speech.
that's right,
You
because they
know,
know it will lead to. I've just read something about the White Rose Gang in Hitler's time. Sophie Scholl and her brothers, and they were arrested for distributing pamphlets against the Nazi regime. And what they did is they gave them a quick kangaroo court trial and then chopped their heads off
yeah.
because a regime like Hitler's could not tolerate dissent.
Well, look at China. I mean, that
Okay.
tennis player, I can't remember her name, that, she said something, she'd been sexually abused by one of the communist leaders, and, where is she now? I don't think anyone knows.
Yeah.
Um, so it's definitely not a good thing. But, the ironic thing in our liberal society now is we're actually having the same problem, where freedom of speech is being curtailed, not in the same totalitarian way, but it's it is now deemed dangerous, and people are fearful. I know this from talking to certain people, of sticking their heads above the parapet. I have been told in no uncertain terms that I shouldn't be having the conversation we're having today.
Yeah.
And
Uh,
and and what fascinates me is we're just having a conversation. What is wrong with the conversation? Obviously, nothing's wrong with the conversation. But so we are living in a in an interesting time where things that we took for granted before are changing. But actually, that may actually not be true. Maybe it's always the case. Maybe it was always the case where things that speech that others or some find discomforting, is always, it's tricky to have those conversations. I couldn't comment on that, and it's probably a perennial thing. So
well, I think one of the big differences now from when both of us were younger is we have social media now. So anybody can be vilified en masse. I
yeah,
mean, like the people who signed that letter in the listener
yeah.
were, um, any anonymous schmo can call you a racist, and that, when there's a million people coming at you on social media, it tends to chill your speech.
I call it being burnt at the digital stake.
That's more or less what it is.
Yeah,
I think that that's still permissible because, after all, people on social media are exercising their free speech.
yeah,
It's just they're not exercising it with much, wisdom. I mean, the fact of what is that what those seven guys said about science and Mātauranga Māori was correct,
yeah.
um, at least in my view as a scientist. But boy, did they get crucified! And
Well,
I'm so
what's I've found interesting in following it is I found the letter, and just to clarify what happened, the seven University of Auckland professors, very eminent professors, wrote what I thought was a very well written, considered, well researched piece, 300 words, so it's very limited. It's a letter to the editor to a national magazine called The Listener. And their concerns are that, what I mentioned earlier before, is that non-scientific material is being encouraged to be taught in the science classroom. That's, there was some other things too, but that's the main one. Um, the the public discourse. I mean, I've yet to see a refutation of what they've said. I've seen lots of ad hominem. I've seen read people calling them racists. I've heard people saying they're old, they're out of touch. Um, again, I've just also the other thing we're going to be talking about is the response from the institutions, the Auckland University, something called, I think it was the New Zealand Science Association,
well,
the Tertiary Teachers Association, and the one that gets me is the Royal Society. Now, The Royal Society of New Zealand. Now, just a bit of context: the Royal Society in England was set up by Isaac Newton in something like 1664 or something like that. The Royal Society of New Zealand is a derivative of that, and it's there to promote science and knowledge. Well, actually, originally three, but sadly, one of the professors has died, Michael Corbelis, tragically. But two of the professors, Cooper and Nola, Professors Cooper and Nola, I'm calling it an inquisition. A inquisition is being held because 5 anonymous complaints were made against them. These two professors are fellows of the society, and an inquisition seems to be being held about whether they should stay in the society or be booted out. Now, there seems to be, as I always say, I'm just a music teacher. I can work out that something like the Royal Society should not be prosecuting eminent New Zealand professors for articulating academic speech, which is well within their legal, ethical, parameters. And the fact that the Royal Society can't work that out says more about the Royal Society than it does about anything else. So, so why don't we now that we're onto the meat of the podcast, why don't we talk about science versus this term other ways of knowing? So for a start, what do you think of this term other ways of knowing?
It's usually a cover for things that aren't science, i.e., beliefs that don't have empirical support. So, when they say ways of knowing, they're trying to make something. I mean, excuse me, things that are characterized as other ways of knowing are like religion, you know, or Mātauranga Māori. I mean, that's another way of knowing, but any kind of indigenous, you know, um, system of beliefs or superstitions or myths or even practical knowledge can be characterized as a way of knowing. But there's only one way of knowing that actually enables you to really know, and that's science. So I really don't like this way of knowing term because it implies that you can know, you know.
Well, yeah, I mean, the way I view it is we're all human. I mean, I'm a humanist. Um, no matter what color, skin, or the shape of your face, or whatever phenotype you are, we're all human. And correct me if I'm wrong, but the genetics show that, doesn't it? So um, we're all coming from it using the tool of our brain. And so really, there's only one way of knowing.
If you're rational.
Yeah.
And that's what Steve Pinker's book Rationality is about. I don't know if you've read it, but I
I
would
haven't read it yet.
recommend it very highly because he just basically tells you what rationality is and how if you why you should be rational as opposed to not being
Yeah.
rational.
So what I'm saying is we're using the same tool, no matter who you are, which is the human brain,
Yeah, but
to come
tool is
to
more than just
conclusions.
an organ. It's also a way of using that organ. I
Yes.
mean, when people that go to church and worship and affirm, the Nicene Creed, which says, I believe this, I believe that, I believe that. They're using the same tool the scientist does. They're just using it in a way that is not useful at attaining truth. Because we're all subject to, excuse me, these biases that Pinker eloquently singles out in his book. In fact, half of the book is a list of all the things that are undermining human rationality constantly. One of them is the me tooism. That is, you feel better if you have a group of people that agree with you, which is what religion is about. Um, so I think when I say tools, I don't really mean organs, even though you have to have a brain in order to be rational. But you have to use it if you want to find out what's real in the universe. First of all, you have to believe that there is something real in the universe, and I'm not going to get into that philosophical
Yeah.
question because everybody thinks that there is, and you know, um, and you have to be able to figure out what that is. These ways of knowing are just I've I don't know if I mean, I don't wanna I love New Zealand, that's why I'm one of the reasons I'm on the show. I don't wanna insult the indigenous people, but I don't think that Mātauranga Māori is it is a way of knowing, but I don't think it's a way of finding out what's true about the universe, and it makes me really, really sad when I see the whole country, both Maori and non-Maori, seemingly united in this desire to do down science, i.e., say that science is no more useful at finding the truth than this indigenous wisdom is. And anybody that knows um, both of those systems knows that the signers of that letter are correct. That ways of knowing like Maranga Maori are useful. They do contain some elements of truth. I mean, obviously, if you're going to make your living in New Zealand before the colonists got there, you had to know some stuff.
Well,
Steve,
I think, can I just interrupt there? I
yeah,
think
go ahead.
the important thing is to distinguish between claims about the universe. So where, let's say, for example, the classic New Zealand Maori myth of the North Island was pulled up by a god, Maui, um, when he was fishing. Now, that is a claim about the universe, um, which we can actually determine is true or not using the scientific method and rationality and all those sorts of things. But then there's cultural knowledge. So, I'm a musician. I play the clarinet. I play Mozart clarinet concerto. So, and I was thinking recently, why do I do that? I mean, it's a 200-year-old piece. Why would I bother? And then I was thinking about Maori carving. Maori carving is making there's a massive renaissance, thankfully, of the Maori culture. Um, you know, because it really did suffer quite a lot through the 19th and early 20th century. So, why does someone carve make a Maori carving in the style of traditional Maori carvings? It's just the same way as I'm playing the Mozart clarinet concerto. So there's enormous amount of cultural knowledge which is um, incredibly important, and neither of us are saying that uh, these cultural artifacts, these cultural knowledge systems, are any better or worse than any other system. But then you've got to distinguish, as I said before, about specific claims about the universe. I mean, I can claim all sorts of things about the universe. I can claim that I fished up the North Island in a previous life from a canoe I built out of feathers. You can, as a scientist, you can actually disprove that probably pretty damn quickly. And so we've got these tools which have emerged. And again, just I'll get you to comment on this. So much of the dialogue talks about Western science. Dialogue against science talks about Western science, which I think is quite laughable, because science is not parochial at all. It's emerged from many continents over time. But so we've got to make that distinction. What we're saying here today is not denigrating. In fact, for me, I'm the more culture, the better. Um, Maori culture is one of the most beautiful cultures that I've come across. But what we're talking about is the substantive claims about the real world and whether that should be placed in a science classroom.
Yeah, well, the answer to that is clearly no. Um,
So what are your thoughts on, so in this white paper from the government, which was lauded by the Minister of Education in a press release, they're arguing for parity between Western knowledge and, again, I'm going to put it inverted, because Western knowledge is not Western knowledge, because it's a mongrel. It's come from everywhere, and that's its strength, not its weakness. Um, Giving parity between Western knowledge and Mātauranga Māori. What are your comments on that?
uh, well,
in the education system. So this
Yeah,
is what we're going to be teaching,
or anything.
13-year-olds.
I mean, and in the education system, it's particularly pernicious because you're going to breed a generation of kids that don't know about how science works because they're going to the classroom and they're told that the North Island and South Island, like you said, are made differently when geology tells us this. Now, is the teacher going to be say, well, we know this, the Maori version is wrong? They're not going to be allowed to say that because you guys are under an authoritarian government, a sort of fascism of knowledge, that it is not permitted to question ways of knowing that are based on indigenous people.
Well,
And I can,
it's I'm going to pull you up on that. It's
yeah,
permitted, and I can say what I want.
well, yeah, but
But it's more. It's actually not. I wouldn't put it being at the heart of the government. It's a social malaise that is occurring.
well,
So,
except the organs of government include the University of Auckland,
no,
right?
yeah, I agree. I agree. But
And
I'm saying it's not the government per se, but it's much wider than that.
yeah, it's the government plus the zeitgeist.
Yeah.
The fact that if
But only,
claims,
sorry, but again, only, we also pull you up on, you mentioned, or I think you said all New Zealanders are, you know,
not all, well,
yeah.
that was an
No,
exaggeration.
I would say it's intellectual, the intellectual elites. I don't think your man on the street, your man and woman on the street, thinking along these lines, because it's not rational for a start, and most
Yeah,
people tend to be rational. But this really reminds me of, what we've touched on before, is your sort of lifelong engagement, battle, whatever you call it, with creationism.
mm,
Because in your blog, which I should mention, everyone should read, Jerry's blog. It's called whyevolutionistrue.com. So in your blog, you said, the Mātauranga Māori is creationist.
yeah. As far as I can read,
And you've
that's
you've battled with creationists in the US all your life.
yeah. And this whole stack of papers plus those on the floor behind me are my attempts to understand Mātauranga Māori because. And I basically what I've come up with is the definition you gave before. It's what we Jews would call a gamish. It's a mixture of technical knowledge, of mythology, of theology, of morality, and some of that qualifies as science, and some of it doesn't. But none of it sufficiently qualifies as science that it deserves co-equal presence in a classroom. So, for example, you can teach that the Maori want to carve a statue, so they do it this particular way. Okay, that's done. It takes a minute to say that. You can say, well, the Maori catch eels this way, and that's knowledge, and this is how they do that. And okay, that takes a minute. But to say that you should expand that into 50% of a science class, to me, is just it's a recipe for disaster, particularly with evolution, because Mātauranga Maori is explicitly creationist. I mean, I'm not sure about the
And sorry,
God.
define creationism.
Well, creationism is the view that divine or supernatural entities are responsible for the presence of life on Earth, and and probably the change of that life over time. That's theistic evolution. But yeah, creationism is a view that non-naturalistic processes, usually based on divinities or gods, are responsible for what we see when we look outside and study biology. So I'm
So
not.
essentially, it's a myth. It's mythological.
Well, it's wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, the way using the word myth to, and this is starting to happen, I think, with Mātauranga Maori, and this is exactly what happened with a lot of biblical assertions. After they started being proven wrong by science, they instead of being tossed into the trash can as we do with a false scientific hypothesis, like the continents didn't move, that's wrong. We threw it away. Nobody argues that the continents are static. But when somebody proves that, well, argues that there was no exodus into the desert by the Jews for 40 years, it turns into a myth. That's what they say. It's a myth or it's a parable or whatever.
So it has metaphorical weight.
metaphorical
Yeah.
connotations, and
So
that's what's happening, I think, with Mātauranga Māori, because I'm reading all these papers now on it where they say, well, we have mythology and stuff, but it's really each of the myths really stands for something true about the universe
yeah.
that
So
we don't
can I give
understand.
you a case which has been put to me recently? So in Maori mythology, there's something called a taniwha, which is sort of equivalent to a troll. It's probably a good analogy. A troll under the bridge. So it's sort of a scary monster that lives in a particular place, a mythological monster. Now, it's it was suggested to me that you can extrapolate that it's not just a myth, that taniwha is not just a myth. It actually means that it's likely that area is likely to be flooded, so you don't build a road there, you don't put a farm there, all that sort of thing. So what's your position or your comments on those
Well,
sorts of
I
things
know
where
that.
it's taking a mythological thing, extrapolating a real world claim?
Yeah, well, I have two reactions to that. I know this story very well because it's the only one that comes up when you ask people, well, give me an example of real knowledge that Mātauranga Māori gives you. And it's always the same thing. It's this water monster whose tail twitches, which really
Yeah.
represents the stream bed changing its course.
The tail is exactly the shape of the river that flows to the sea.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And so, they decided to build a road around that because of the wisdom of the Maori. And my reaction to that is twofold. Well, first of all, if Mātauranga Maori is such a great knowledge system, why do they only have one example that they use over and over and over and over again? And besides, you don't need to have this myth. All you have to do is watch the stream. That's empirical science and see what it does. And then when you watch it enough, you say, well, it's going to flood, so you don't put the road through the part that's gonna flood. So
the other thing is, are there taniwhas in Africa?
as what?
Are there taniwhas in Africa as well, or in Europe, where other streams have formed exactly the same shapes?
Yeah,
So
no,
what's the constant variable? Taniwhas in Russia, in America, in Africa, or hydrodynamics?
yeah, I mean, it's obviously hydrodynamics, and that is the modern scientific way of looking at it, and to say that putting this troll into the mix is gonna add anything to what you can know by observation or by modern science,
Yeah,
it doesn't. So you can imagine how confusing this is to kids, or putting a kid in a science classroom. Now, I think the Marango Maori version of creation is more explicit. It's not just a metaphor that they do believe, I think, and only your listeners will know, but as far as I can determine, everything came from a mating of two original gods. And by everything, it doesn't just mean humans, but everything alive.
mm,
Now, that's palpably not true.
yeah,
It's palpably false. Now, go in a classroom and you give the kids the modern theory of evolution, neo Darwinism, and then you give them this myth. Well, what I would call it a lie. I mean, we know enough now to know that it is a myth because
yeah.
it's taught to people, but in terms of science, it's an untruth.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, how Steven Pinker put it is he was sort of saying that it comes from the same imperative to find out about the world. So it was a story they came up with in a pre-scientific era to say, this is how it happened. So you could say it's just it's a wonderful bit of imagination, and it's forgivable in a pre-scientific world. In a post-scientific world, it's actually unforgivable.
Yeah, it is, and the problem, of course, is when you have kids being taught modern evolutionary biology and the creationist story on the other side, and then the teachers clearly are not going to be allowed to say, "Well, modern science is right and indigenous knowledge is wrong." I mean, if you say that, I mean, I just can't imagine the kerfuffle that would cause. If somebody tried to show that modern science actually
Yeah.
is better.
Well, getting back to authoritarian regimes, you are not allowed to say certain things are wrong. If going
Yeah.
back to the Nazis, if I got up there and said, "Oh, actually, I think Hitler's wrong for killing 6 million Jews," you know what would happen to me. So, although that's an extreme example, it is nevertheless disturbing to live in a society where it's actually uh, impermissible to say certain things and to say certain things are wrong. Um, I mean, I've heard intelligence is just a series of corrections. I've heard another, that applied to science. Science is just a error correction process, and so to get through life, error correction is fundamental. Um, so if we can't point out errors, again, if we can't point out the emperor has no clothes, that's not healthy for society in the long run.
Yeah, and that's what scares me about this New Zealand initiative. I can be happy with any indigenous people having any religion or belief system they want, but they better keep their hands off my science. It's a hard one, it's true. And if they try to make this indigenous knowledge, which is of course is different from indigenous knowledge in South America and Africa and Alaska, if they try to make it co-equal with science, the consequences are going to be disastrous. I mean, not just for the children themselves who are going to be deeply confused. Well, how do we know what's true? And the teachers, I mean, you can correct me here, but I don't think a teacher is going to be allowed to say that the Maori creation story is wrong and evolution is right.
Well,
Because if you,
it's regardless of whether they're allowed to or not. The worst thing in a society is self censorship, and this is what concerns me. Um, I mean, I've heard stories of a lot of people who agree with the seven professors' letter. Again, the letter is called "In Defense of Science." The professors are receiving emails saying, "Yeah, we wholeheartedly agree, but we couldn't say that in public." So the zeitgeist of fear. And again, as I said, I've been told in no uncertain terms that I shouldn't even be having this conversation with you today.
yeah,
Which
that's,
it's if it wasn't so tragic, it's laughable.
yeah, that's just what I mean. If I was going to leave your listeners with any message, it would be, well, I can't say for God's sake because I don't believe it. This was
Say for God's sake, why not use his name?
that's the word metaphorically. For God's sake, do not let your schools and your universities um, denigrate science by equating it to a bundle of mythology, superstition, empirical claims that are by no means co-equal with science. Because in the end, New Zealand will become the laughing stock of the world scientifically. I mean, I there's already a rumor that the Royal Society of London has sent a letter to the Royal Society of New Zealand saying, and nobody knows what it says because it's deeply secret, but it's going to be something along the lines of, "Hey, you guys better watch it. You're saying that science is just as is no better than this indigenous belief system." I wish that that letter would be made public,
Yeah.
but it would be deeply embarrassing
Well,
to the RSNZ.
yeah, well, one thing I'll point out is Richard Dawkins. Anyone who doesn't know Richard Dawkins, he would be, one of the most famous scientists in the world um, over the last, 50 years. He's written a incredibly strong email to the Royal Society saying, um, essentially, saying that they're on the wrong track. I could phrase it more colourfully, but I won't. You've written a letter, I think. Is that correct?
I just read on my website, and
Yeah,
people
yeah, yeah, yeah. But what I'll do is I'll in the show notes I'll include the email for the head of the Royal Society, and so if anyone wants to write a letter, the information will be there. So I'll encourage you to do that. But getting back to teaching Mātauranga Māori in the classroom, how I think about it is one, and I'm not a scientist, but I'm just um, um, this is what how I would phrase it. Science is hard. You tell me if I'm wrong. Science is incredibly hard in the first place. Educating people to think scientifically is not easy because, in a sense, our minds are not necessarily hardwired for it. New Zealand has one of the lowest, if not the lowest, I can't quite remember, stats for science and mathematics
Yeah, I know that's true.
for in the education system.
For comparable countries.
Yeah, for comparable countries. Oh, it'll be OECD or something like that. Okay, so and then go down, go one more step, which is even more tragic. So that's tragic. We should have one of the highest.
Yes.
Okay, Maori and Polynesian students have substantially worse statistics in regard to science and mathematics education. Now, the proponents of this white paper will argue that the problem is that their culture is not instantiated in the classroom, and but I think what we would both say is that adding Mātauranga Māori or non-scientific information into the scientific classroom is actually going to impede Māori and Pacific Island students, as well as all the others, even more. So we're starting from a spot just above zero, and I think we both agree that by doing this, it's going to make it worse.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not only the Maori that are going to suffer, because they're not going to. Their beliefs that are unscientific, that don't comport with modern science, are going to be validated because they're going to be taught in science. But also, they're not going to learn as much modern science
Yeah.
that's going to be useful to not just New Zealand but to the world. So this is what really bothers me, and it all comes from the view, which we also have in America, that it's the valorization of the oppressed, I call it. That if somebody
Yes.
is
Yeah.
oppressed in the past, then they have to be better than we are now, as because we're the oppressors. You're the crown, right? So that's what they call it. I just discovered, even though New Zealand is not a monarchy, but they call it the crown.
Oh, yeah, the crown. Well, yeah, it is called the
Yeah,
crown, yeah.
so I mean, the Maori were oppressed. Their story
Oh,
is a
just
heroic.
sorry, just to clarify that for listeners who aren't aware. So the New Zealand government is essentially called the Crown because we derive we're Westminster Parliament and all that sort of thing. So when the Treaty of Waitangi, which was in 1840, which
Yeah.
was a treaty between the Maori tribes in New Zealand at the time, and not all of them, but a majority of them, and the English Crown. So essentially between the English government and the Maori tribes, which is also interesting because that treaty is between those entities, but one of them doesn't exist anymore in New Zealand, which is we now have a New Zealand government. Anyway, that's an aside.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
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 sorry, carry on.
yeah. I forgot what we were talking
Well,
about.
you're talking about the crown. Well, maybe what you were talking about was the validation, I think was the
Oh,
word,
they
of
oppressed.
of the oppressed.
And we see the same thing here in America now. For example, Hispanics and Black in particular are not performing on par. And it's probably for the same reason that the Maori are dispossessed, because they were discriminated against historically and weren't given the same opportunities. But it's particularly in America, people do not say, I mean, Black people are given latitude to say things that, white people are not allowed to say. But it seems to me it's worse in New Zealand because, well, I just read something that I have it right here, but I don't read it. That the Maori, which I think constitutes 16% of the population of New Zealand,
I think that's right.
are given half, or they assume that this treaty in 1840 entitles them to half of all the resources, which means half of the classroom space and half of the money that's going to be given out to research. And I think 15.3% of New Zealanders are Asians. So that's almost the same as the Maori, but they're not. They're considered oppressed too in the United States, but they're not given this same benefit. So, I mean, the valorization of the oppressed has its good side, which is that we got to work to give everybody the same opportunities to achieve. But you don't do that by validating their myths in the science classroom. It's not going to help the Maori. It's not going to help science. I just can't believe that New Zealand and its government, and well, not everybody, I'm not implicating everybody, but certainly, the Ardern government and the Minister of Education, I know the University of Auckland, are all behind this push for parity of ways of knowing with science. And New Zealand was a country that I always admired because it was so damn sensible. I mean, they won't allow nuclear armed ships to dock in their ports. They did a great job with COVID. Nobody is homeless. They don't, I mean, it's not,
They were the first country to give women the vote.
yeah, that's right. So,
We
it's a,
decriminalized homosexuality. You know,
uh,
we
yeah, I
had
forgot about
gay marriage. Blah de blah de blah. Yeah, we're
yeah.
very very liberal society, um, and I suppose you could argue a lot of this movement is illiberal.
Yeah, it's illiberal, but it comes out of the liberal motivation, right?
Mm,
That the
mm.
underdog is to be helped. The problem is that you don't help the underdog
By harming them.
by lowering the bar,
Yeah,
which is what we're doing in America. We've eliminated standardized tests more or less because the minorities don't do as well on them, or by teaching them that their cultural myths are actually equivalent to science.
yeah.
So, I mean, it causes me a lot of cognitive dissonance to see a country that I admire so much, and then I visited because I admired it so much, and everything I knew about it was justified when I visited it. I told you about my month-long stay there and how great it was, but at the same time, they're it's like they're a railroad train that's just jumped the tracks on this one issue.
Well, it's that thing if you can have too much of a good thing, you can take things too far. So
Yeah,
so so you're obviously you're on the left, so you're, that's what you're saying, about New Zealand appeals to your politics in a sense. But again, you can take things too far. You can have, I was saying before we started, what I call an empathy trap. So empathy is generally a good thing, but you can have too much empathy. So if you take parenting, you have to be empathetic to your child, but if you're too empathetic, they've just become spoiled brats. So, I mean, I think a lot of this, um, to me, aligns a lot of what you're talking about before was what was the word you not validation,
oh,
of
well, yeah, valorization of the
valorization of the oppressed.
yeah.
To me, that's just straight out of Marx. It's taking you see the world in dichotomies. The world is not two. It's not black and white. It's many shades of grey. Um, but you see the world in dichotomies. So you see the oppressed, the oppressor, and the oppressed, and your aim is to turn that around. So ironically, the oppressors can be sorry, the oppressed can become the oppressors in some cases. Um, and again, being a student of history, I've yet to see a successful Marxist regime where I'd want to live, or where most of the world would want to live. They tend to collapse under their own weight. Um, just a few questions. Um, you know, because in this white paper, one of the things it talks about, it encourages the discussion that um, essentially the teaching that in inverted commas, Western science is a tool for the domination and subjugation, a colonial tool for the domination and subjugation of indigenous peoples. What are your comments on that?
That's just bogus. You could say that architecture. I mean, just because you know, I don't, I get so outraged by that statement because it's correlational, not causational.
Just explain what you mean by that.
It means that the colonizers of New Zealand had Western, or I don't like to call it Western science, had modern science.
Or just science.
Yeah, it had
What's
science.
wrong with that word? Yeah.
Yeah, I know. In fact, that's what I should use. Um, but it can get you in trouble, maybe in New Zealand. I don't know what could get me in trouble in New Zealand. Um, because they had science, that therefore science was what the main reason why the indigenous peoples were suppressed and mistreated, but that's not true. They were suppressed and mistreated because of xenophobia. Now, it's true that the colonists had guns, which you could say are a product of, Western technology, which is a product of science, and therefore science produced the ability to overcome the Maori. But that's like saying that architects are responsible for the Holocaust because they helped design the gas chambers. I mean, it's the people that and the bad actions of people that result in this kind of oppression, not science. Science basically is a set of tools for finding out how the world is. It's not a set of tools for teaching you how to oppress somebody else. Because science, I mean, look, Darwin.
So just add on that, in any of your science education in college and university, was part of the discussion of how you can use science as a tool to oppress and dominate indigenous peoples around the world?
No, I mean it's
So
foolish.
be honest, Jerry.
No, I am. I'm trying. Let me think for a sec.
Yeah.
No, because I mean, when I
There are no textbooks that instantiate that.
yeah, there are. And if you go back in the well, they won't. If you go back in the past in the 20s or stuff, you will find genetics and evolution books that are based on scientific racism.
Yeah.
You know, that say that humans evolved many times. That's wrong. It's called polygeny rather than once. And some races are inferior and some are superior. And it just happens to be the race of the person that wrote the book, i.e., white people, that is the best one.
Yeah.
But that's all gone now. I mean,
Yeah,
we all know the
but
fallacies of this.
yeah,
Uh,
so I think the thing is, to remember when we say science, I mean, I say, I put this to Steven Pinker, and he agreed to me. I say science is getting most things. Sorry, start that again. Science is getting. Sorry, science is a process of getting most things wrong and some things right. So in the universe, there's more ways to get things wrong. There's more way to miss the target than to hit the target. So if you look back historically, we're more likely to get things wrong in the past because we had less knowledge, less verifiably true beliefs. And science also is a process of eliminating as much as possible our human biases. But as we can, again, going back in history, our biases are very, very strong. And in a sense, they're stronger in the past because we had less ways of error correcting. So you may have had a scientist, and again, this is not to diminish any of the negative things that have been done or said or perpetrated on anyone or any people. But you have a scientist who can come up with some harebrained scheme, put it in a book, but it's more a reflection of what you're talking about, their racism, their xenophobia, their biases, than actually the scientific project as a whole. And if science is what is being said about it, if that's true, then surely wouldn't those terrible xenophobic, racist premises be verified by the scientific project? And we can say, again, I'm a music teacher. I can work out that it's quite easy. It doesn't take me much searching on the internet to work out that that is definitely not the case.
yeah, and I've never, in my own education, never a word have I heard of anything that would be like that. You combine that with Steve's other view, which is that moral progress is progressing over time, so we're getting more moral. So that's the reason why these ridiculous assertions made in the 20s and 30s about superior versus inferior groups of people are not acceptable today. It's not just that the science doesn't support them, but you couldn't even pretend to get away with saying them. You couldn't say, "Look, you're wrong here," because we know that this is to be true when it isn't true. So if you combine moral progress with what science really is, you just have to come to the view that science is not a tool for oppression. It's some scientists who are bigoted, but now I mean, to say that it's still a tool of oppression, this really bothers me. because people still make these same claims. But if you look at the evidence that they use for that, they have to go way back in the days when people were much worse
Yeah.
than they are now. I
So
mean,
I'm hearing a lot of the word, I'm hearing the need to decolonize institutions. What do
that's
you
just
what do you
that
think?
just
I
means
I
get rid of science
Yeah,
or
I
yeah,
saw
go,
I saw a photograph of, there was a protest or something, and there was a placard, and it said something like decolonize the university or decolonize whatever the institution was. And I thought I wanted to Photoshop it and say decolonize this sign. The sign they were holding up is a product of science. You cannot produce paper, you cannot
yeah.
produce even the stick without science and technology. So the proponents of decolonizing institutions they don't know anything about history, and they don't know anything about science and technology.
I'm not even sure they know what they're talking about.
I
I mean,
would say,
ask them, what do you mean by decolonize the university? What would they say? I suppose they would say get rid of the hegemony of science. That's one thing. Get rid of all the vestiges of culture that were in play over the Renaissance and over the Enlightenment.
what you're talking about is removing uh, evolutionarily produced knowledge from the globe, that is derived from all around the globe, because a certain subset of humanity on an island far away from the rest of the world has a series of truth claims which are, in a sense, better. That's essentially what they're saying.
Hmm.
Um, and again, just to clarify this point, my point here is I am I love culture. The more culture, the better. The more culture, the merrier, really. Um, but what we're talking about is a system of knowledge that is hard. It was hard won. It was very difficult. Essentially the scientific method is a complete aberration in human history, isn't it? And
Hmm.
we're very lucky to be living in a time where we actually have access to that knowledge. And no one's advocating going back to the Stone Ages and pre-scientific era. This is what I quite find quite interesting. People will write, they'll be on a computer or on an iPhone. They'll be writing decolonize this particular institution. I've never seen decolonize the iPhone.
It has to be institutions that are. It's a power struggle over who controls
I think, yeah.
the
There's
power.
that the line, and all the president's men follow the money. I think
Yeah,
I think it gets, and again, if you think about postmodernism, which is just power obsessed, or Marxism, which is just power obsessed. I wonder if a lot of this is derived from those ideologies,
yeah. I don't know.
where power is sort of the only metric.
Yeah, I mean, all I know is that it's very authoritarian.
Yeah.
It's trying to drown out the opposition, not by reasoned argument, but by force. And
What
when I
what
see
are your
like,
thoughts? What are your thoughts on the claims of hurt feelings? So the vice chancellor of Auckland University, she's the vice chancellor is actually the person who runs the place, not the chancellor.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
I didn't
and
know that. Right?
her
It's
her reaction to this the letter by the seven professors was that it had caused, this is basically a quote, maybe paraphrasing, um, you know, a, a lot of harm and distress.
yes, but the Royal Society of New Zealand said something very similar.
Yeah.
I think. I, my response to that is not going to be empathic. It's going to be life is hard. You're the world is not here to bolster your feelings. Suck it up. You know, if the truth happens to offend you, well, that's too bad. It doesn't make the truth go away. If the people try to make the truth go away because they're offended. I mean, that's Don Freshwater you're talking about, the
Yeah.
VC at
Yes. Yes.
Boston University. Yeah, I found that appalling. And I found it appalling that the Royal Society would also use this hurt feelings trope. as I think as Stephen Fry says, or maybe it was Christopher Hitchens, or probably both of them, says, "So you're offended. So what? That's not an argument. That's just a recounting of how you feel." I mean, I might get offended if I have a theory, a scientific theory, and somebody attacks it. But I don't shut them down by saying, "Well, you're offending me by attacking my theory." So I'm not going to pay any attention to you. That's just not the way the world works.
Yeah.
It's the offense card, as we call it in America, is often not genuine. That is really how much harm was caused, according to Dr. Freshwater, by this letter in the listener. How many people sat down and sobbed themselves to sleep that night or shot themselves in the head? None. I
And
mean,
how
really,
and how does she know?
yeah. I mean, yeah, because
Did
whenever they,
she do a scientific empirical study,
oh, of course not, probably
or did
one
she
person.
just make it up?
Well, that could be likely. I mean, my feeling is that the offense card is played when you have no other way to oppose somebody that's saying something you don't like. And very often it's not a genuine thing. Often when people say, this is harmful, there's a difference between being offended and being harmed, as you mentioned before,
Mm.
But I would just say, so what?
Yeah. Well,
You know?
I say I'm offended every day by so many things, but,
Oh yeah.
who cares?
Yeah,
Um,
that's life. You
that's
know?
life, yeah.
You can't tolerate being offended, then you're in sorry shape, and I would urge people to seek therapy. I mean,
Yeah.
that's the ultimate thing that you can use, because a lot of these people actually do need therapy. They're on the verge of personality disorder because they mistake that for an argument, which it's not. It's just a statement of how you feel or how you're supposed to feel.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
Well,
I'm appalled that the head of Auckland University would say something like that.
yeah.
I mean, this is it. This whole controversy, time after time after time, I'm offended. I'm offended when Don Freshwater says something so
Yeah.
palpably stupid. I'm offended when the Royal Society of New Zealand takes to task two of its members who are only using their freedom of speech to defend science. I'm offended by the Ardern's government refusing to stand up for the truth, the scientific truth. But I'm not going to say, okay, you can't do that. You're offended. I'm going to use arguments.
Yeah.
I'm going to use arguments about why creationism of Mātauranga Māori is not the truth compared to our biological view of where things came from. So yeah, I get offended a lot.
Yeah.
I don't like being offended by one of my favorite countries in the world.
Yeah.
You know,
Um,
so,
now to close, I think this would be a good way to close the podcast. You have been at the University of Chicago since 1996, I think, if that's correct.
1980,
1986. Okay, yeah. So
36 years.
yeah, okay. Now, the University of Chicago is not like a whole lot of other universities in the way they um, promote discourse. Do you want to talk to that? And
Uh,
maybe, it's almost in as an address to Dawn French and the Royal Society and all the other institutions who've cried hurt feelings.
Yeah, we have two. We're almost unique in American universities in two ways, mainly in one. First, it's the academic freedom and freedom of speech are almost absolute here. If somebody says something that's politically incorrect or unwoke, in other places they could really get down on. We had a professor here that was criticizing diversity and inclusion initiatives. I didn't necessarily agree with what he said, but the students immediately demanded that his courses be taken away from him. And I think that's happened in your country as well. And the university didn't say anything about this particular incident. They just said, we stand up for a freedom of speech of our professors, which basically is leave this guy alone. So we have this complete freedom of speech. It's getting eroded around the margins, which worries me now. But we have the Chicago Principles of Free Expression, which anybody can find online. It's basically the First Amendment meant to apply to colleges. You can say whatever the hell you want to say, except in a few limited circumstances. If it hurts the university's mission, then, you know, if you were going to say that, for example, that well, I can't even think of an example. That's how much freedom we have that would violate that. But we also have something called the Kelvin principle, and this is where
Sorry, say that again. That the what?
Kalven. It's named after a man named Harry Calvin, who back in the '60s was head of a committee that was charged with determining whether the university could take official stands on ideological, political, and moral positions. And it came in during the Vietnam War when everybody was saying that the University of Chicago should condemn our incursion into Vietnam. Of course, none of the professors favored that. We're all a bunch of liberal, almost commies here, and the students didn't like that. And Harry Calvin wrote, and this is one of the most important aspects of the University of Chicago, which no other university in the world that I know of has this policy. And you can look it up in the Chicago foundational principles. If you just Google that,
I'll
you'll
I'll
see it.
put I'll add it in the show notes.
Yeah, okay. And it's Kalvn report. And that is that the university, and by university, I mean the administration, the officials, and the departments as units of the university, are not allowed to make any pronouncement about politics, about ideology, about morality. Why? Because that creates a repressive climate. If, for example, but this has happened lately after George Floyd was murdered, which is a horrific thing, all the departments started wanting to put up statements about, we need to have diversity, we need to have equity, equal representation, we need to do this, we need to do that. Well, those are ideological statements, and many of which were debatable. They weren't just, I mean, there's, and, there's other things as well. You should do this, you should do that. We want you to go out in the streets, we should defund the police. I don't know if that's an American trend. Get rid of the cops, even. And those are political and ideological statements. They're debatable. You are not allowed to say them, even though some of them are still up on university websites, because it inhibits people from taking opposite views. If you're a untenured professor coming up for tenure and your department has a statement up there that we need to defund the police, and you feel otherwise, and I feel otherwise, we need the police, especially in a place like Chicago, you're not going to voice your opposition. So there's two components to the Chicago plan. There is the freedom of speech, but there's also a policy which allows you freedom of speech because it prevents other people from threatening you with harm if you speak your mind. And that's where Auckland University needs to step up. They should not be making statements like this about these professors that signed this letter. The Royal Society should not be making statements about these professors have caused harm because their statement of what they said about science is not exactly correct. you know so we have these two foundational principles, and both of them are intimately connected to prevent people from being inhibited in what they want to say. I think that 80 universities in America have adopted the Chicago Principles of Free Speech, which are basically, as I said, the First Amendment. You can say whatever you want without fear of punishment. Now, we're a private university. We do not have to abide by the First Amendment. Public universities do because they're considered parts of the government, and so is Auckland University, by the way. But we don't have to, but we do because it's just the right thing to do. If you want to have a functioning university, you have to have a populace that's free to debate and speak. And 80 and one by one American colleges are recognizing that this is the right thing to do. But no college has adopted the Coven principle, which prevents them. So every time Don Freshwater says, you're causing harm to people who are criticizing indigenous knowledge, that is going to chill professors and students from saying the opposite. And you can make a good case for the opposite, but they're not going to do that. People that have lost their jobs, have lost their teaching positions because they've taken an opposition to this line about, indigenous knowledge being equal to science. That's a speech chiller. Um, so it's my view that every university that aspires to be a real university, a place where truth is attained or try to be attained by the winnowing out among diverse and conflicting views. Every university that aspires to do that should adopt both of these principles. Unfortunately, New Zealand seems to be going backwards. I mean, I'm not saying that everybody in the country, but as far as I can determine, the government and the universities and the secondary schools are trying to make only one point of view valid and the other point of view, which is science is the best way to find out stuff, invalid. So,
Right. Well, we'll leave it there. But
okay.
thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. Uh, it's been a
Sure.
great honor to talk to you.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Let me leave your listeners with one message, which they probably have discerned from this like 2 hour conversation we've had, which is just to the government of New Zealand and the educators of New Zealand. I would say, please come to your senses about this way of knowing thing. You can do better than you're doing now. And that's all I would like to say.
Well, it's a beautiful way to end it. Thank you
Okay.
very
Thanks
much.
for having me on.
Pleasure.